Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice program here at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And each week I hold the Curatorial Roundtable where I invite a distinguished curator or institutional director to speak about their practice. And today I'm happy to have Billy Tang with us, and I'm just going to read a short bio for Billy. But before I do that, just to note that Billy will speak for about 50 minutes. After 50 minutes, there will be about 10 minutes for questions. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A. If you don't see it, click on More, and you'll find it in that area. And that's where you put your question. For Billy, I'll read the questions aloud, and that's how it goes. So with that, welcome, Billy. This is a special pleasure in that it's the second time that you've spoken with us over the years. So Billy's short bio reads, Billy Tang is the artistic director of the new London-based nonprofit YDP, a laboratory space for new forms of artistic community, experimentation, and institutional dialogue, excuse me, dedicated to Asian and Asian diaspora artists. A prominent curator and writer known for his work with art institutions in the UK, mainland China, and Hong Kong, Billy built a reputation for championing mid-career and emerging artists and for rethinking exhibition making as experimental living processes rather than static displays. His practice focuses on advancing diversity and amplifying the voices of historically marginalized artists from the Asia-Pacific region, a focus informed by his personal history as the son of Vietnamese refugees who settled in the UK and experience of migration, displacement, and diasporic identity. Previously, Billy served as executive director and curator of Parasite in Hong Kong. He's also held senior curatorial roles at the Rockbund Art Museum in Shanghai and the artist-run Magician Space in Beijing. His writings have appeared in numerous publications, including ArtAsiaPacific, Leap, and Mousse. And with that, welcome, Billy.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Stephen. And I just want to thank everyone and colleagues at SVA again for the invitation to share. It comes off the back of roughly 12 to 15 years working as a curator in Asia, specifically in Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. And I've just recently returned to the place that I grew up in and was born in London to be the artistic director of YDP. So I think while everything is fresh, I'm excited to share experiences of how I became a curator, and I think we've kind of explored different themes along the way. So I'll just open my presentation. And this is also a little bit of a grounding exercise to begin the presentation. This is also inspired by a research trip to Aotearoa, otherwise known as New Zealand, with Maori cultural workers, where before we begin a presentation, it's kind of a connection to the people that I'm speaking to and to kind of a way to share the flow of where I also have come from as well. So there's kind of three images that kind of talk about this as well. So on the right, kind of this is an image taken, I think perhaps by my mother in London, and the person that's holding the cloud is me. So I chose this because I think in terms of being a curator, it doesn't come from a vacuum for me in terms of the idea of authorship. There's always a village behind. And I kind of see the influence of my parents, who were also, in a way, in the line of working with translation between cultures, as well as social work. So this image is a community project that was initiated by my mother, with kind of Vietnamese kind of community groups in collaboration with basically an arts group in London, to kind of celebrate a kind of origin story of Vietnamese. So this is kind of she was the first kind of first wave of immigrants, and I'm the second generation. And I think this was also interesting to kind of, for me as an experience, just to share briefly. The middle image is Vietnam. So I am Chinese Vietnamese of origin. So I share ancestry in the south of China as well as Vietnam. And this image is to kind of express what Vietnam kind of means to me, which is the kind of land known as a land of mountain and rivers. And on the left is an image of a landmark of the hometown of my parents called Haiphong. And I think this image for me is also very unique in the kind of many kind of public spaces in kind of communist countries. This is probably a rare example of a public sculpture. It's much more kind of feminine kind of sculpture, quite sassy. I mean, I really kind of was struck by the pose of this statue, and it actually is the statue of a really famous general who was part of an insurrection against the Eastern Han, which for 3 years Vietnam was kind of existing as a kind of matriarchal society. And actually, one of the most famous kind of generals of this kind of movement was from Haiphong. Haiphong also has a lot of kind of intellectuals that have contributed a lot to kind of revolutionary Vietnam as well. So it's kind of maybe a little bit of a sense of the place where I'm from, and I think that kind of strong identity, I think, of the role of of women, I think, have I've come from a family of quite really powerful women, and I think that's also influenced me as a great deal. So I'm going to show you another slide. So as I mentioned, it does take a village to especially for curators that maybe lack representation of visibility. I think a lot about this, about how I became a curator and how I was given this opportunity. And I think it was because of the love and support of family that I could take this risk. It was not, it can also be quite difficult in the early stages of your career. And yeah, I think a lot of the trust that my family have is maybe partly because they had things taken away from them. And so, for example, a little bit more about my family history is we are ethnic Chinese, and I think my parents were maybe 3 or 4 generations in Vietnam now. And after the war from the American aggression, and Haiphong also was a place that was bombed heavily, as it was once described as the Paris of the Orient. And it's a strategic port, similar to Hong Kong, where it's another place that I kind of lived as well. And in the twists and turns of geopolitics, once being allies together with China and Vietnam, were at war after the kind of the war with America, and the ethnic minority group quickly became ostracized, and so this is kind of also the aftermath of many kind of like events of war. You have different waves, and it doesn't kind of it doesn't stop in that sense, and it is a flow where after the trauma, I think there were lots of particularly vulnerable groups that felt the need to kind of leave Vietnam, and so these images kind of illustrate a little bit of the story of kind of my immigration as boat people. They escaped Vietnam, first to Hong Kong, and then gradually to a new life in London. And becoming the executive director of Parasite, for example, was kind of thinking a lot about these flows and the kind of different directions that we go to. So perhaps you will get a sense of the influence of this background in my work as well, which I'll go on to now. So basically, I thought to share maybe a few strands of to connect the kind of various places that I've worked in, also exhibitions and projects, and people that I've collaborated with. So kind of a little bit of a kind of strand to kind of keep at the back of your head is this idea of curating between the planned and the ad hoc. And then the idea of also how to sustain cultural spaces during cycles of urban growth and decline. So, what do I mean by urban growth and decline? I'm going to quickly share a few quotes that I think have been really influential for me. There was a project called City on the Move, Cities on the Move, and it was kind of thinking a lot about urbanism and particularly within the lens of Asia. I think a lot of these kind of quotes also talk a lot about kind of the language and framing of Asia, which was kind of in this futurist lens of this kind of acceleration towards the kind of a kind of bright future, or often touted as the kind of as future cities, and seeing how that could reposition the idea of culture from within this. Like, so there's a lot of language thinking about the city as a stage, a new kind of way to think about vocabularies that were kind of maybe pivoted away from Western-centric models. And I think a little bit of what I want to share today as well is kind of outside of the framework of growth. What does it mean to be in a city where decline is happening as well, or entropy, or seeing these as cycles? And I think that's definitely something I think within the last 15 years that Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong share together in a way, a kind of ebb and flow of openness, closeness, of things that are suddenly appearing. For example, the rise of museums and art spaces and infrastructure. But then, we will constantly have this idea that these things will be in perpetuality, forever, basically. But in reality, I think there are moments when it becomes increasingly hard to sustain. So mentally, theoretically, perhaps, and how can we think about this in a pragmatic sense as cultural workers, as curators? I think this is really important to think about, particularly in regions such as Asia. Yeah, this is a little bit of a diagram of what happens when the shit hits the fan, figuratively as well. I think this is kind of quite important to think about. Um, I think another kind of influence for me as well is also coming from artists. And so the two images on the right-hand side come from, I think for me, uh, the influence and also the work of an artist, Abraham Chris Villegas. So he came from a place called Ayusco. Oops, I need to turn off my phone. Um, I think a suburb was become now a suburb in Mexico City, which was previously considered a land that was impossible to build upon for the demands of a modern city due to its kind of volcanic land. But through successive generations of migration, particularly from indigenous folks, there was a kind of new vernacular of grassroots kind of architecture, self-organized often, which then led to innovation of the possibilities for life to thrive. In fact, in land that was considered impossible from the standard of traditional and conventional thinking of urban planning. And that's kind of in a way influenced his approach to sculpture, particularly in art making in general, through a philosophy that he's developed called auto construction. And so I think this is also maybe perhaps interesting to kind of also kind of think in the back of your head as well in relation to cities on the move that I mentioned, this idea of particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, the framing of Asia being constantly on the upward kind of tick, and how to kind of in a way join that wave and align art to this, and in moments where of perhaps potentially precarity or considered an inhabitable land, how can self-organization appear? And often these innovations and experiments are driven by artists, and how do you reconcile with these two different ways of thinking? So yeah, taking the cue from architecture, and yeah, this idea of the planned and the ad hoc as well, and the city at large as well. So I think, yeah, I think I shared a quote here in terms of the art industry's fluctuation and shift in politics. Its contradictions are often not isolated. So I think a lot about how do they intersect with or resist the global struggles that inevitably or increasingly affect us all. Yeah. So I've kind of also structured this talk around three chapters. My experiments as kind of an emerging cultural worker in Beijing. To chapter two, we'll talk about working in Shanghai within a more formal institutionalized space. And then the third would be related to my work in Hong Kong with Parasite. So chapter one is thinking about the possibilities of small space and how does a small space survive or operate and navigate between moments of openness and closedness. And I'm kind of mentioning this specifically also related to geopolitics, where I think, as a kind of quick summary, I think the moment around 2008 or culminated into the Olympics in Beijing was this kind of dream of perhaps specifically being integrated into the quote unquote world order, and then the kind of disillusion of that kind of dream and the kind of polarization that has happened. For example, one byproduct being trade war and the difficulty of moving literally between borders. So when I talk about also the importance of, the city, like what makes the city, and in general, what is kind of the fabric of society in a way, and how that correlates to, this identity or persona of what kind of curatorial practices or artistic movements or individuals can emerge from within this. I think this is quite an interesting self-made map and diagram that I've created. I should have put here a book that I was quoting on, but essentially, I think what makes Beijing unique as a city is its master plan. You have at the center, even the word China, it means Middle Kingdom. And Beijing being, one of the capitals, it's really on this kind of central axis of the idea of heaven and its connection to earth. So where the rulers was, the whole city kind of emanates from that kind of center. There's a drum tower that is basically the clock of the city that's directly above. It's an incredible. It's incredible that there's such an ancient cosmic urban plan exists today. And when the communists took over, I think they had a decision and a dilemma to basically build a new city adjacent to this ancient infrastructure in a way because the demands of contemporary life, to try to fit everything within that, there's obviously going to be a lot of struggles. But because of the symbolism, the decision was made to basically occupy the cosmic plan. And so you'll see a lot of the kind of problems and that are specific to Beijing kind of emanating to this day from that decision, including almost like a cannibalization effect, or a kind of, as it's expanded, almost like tree rings, you have like a ring road system that just perpetually is just kind of growing. Traffic is really bad, for example, as a result. But when you look at artistic movements and the mobility, if we're thinking about cities on the move and culture workers on the move as a result. Just as this kind of short history, like the pioneering before we have like museums and gallery spaces, when we're thinking about self-organization, performance art was particularly prominent with collectives, the most immediate kind of medium that you could have, also in response to maybe economic and political precarity is your body, so for example, won't go too much into it, but the Beijing East Village, they started, around here. Can you see on the top left this kind of circle? This area. And as the city has kind of grown and gentrified, there's been a kind of recurrent pattern with initiatives happening, being in areas that are traditionally affordable, often in proximity to migrant workers. And then when the gentrification kicks in, there's displacement that happens either through political pressure or economic pressure. Well, nowadays the most when we think about Beijing art scene and what's synonymous to that, it's 798, which I will talk to you about. It's also on traditionally was on the margins of the city. This time on the opposite end, on the top right. But then with in terms of studios, artist studios, it's also been a kind of cat and mouse game, and a lot of places have been kind of demolished, and kind of this hasn't, it's been a continuous pattern in a way. But it's kind of interesting to see this in context to the urban grid. So, this is 798. This is also was once, strategically on the margins of the city. It was a factory created and designed in collaboration with the Russians and the East Germans. The most prominent buildings, I think, are designed by the East Germans, so in kind of almost Bauhaus, kind of similarities with kind of Bauhaus kind of style. You can see, for example, on the bottom left. And so from being a factory, a literal factory that was kind of self-sufficient with its own schools and cafeteria, gymnasiums, education spaces, etc., it's kind of bloomed first initially also through self-organized, as kind of studios and so forth before into a kind of industry, and now kind of fast tracked to now it's almost literally become a factory of art. So, you can see, I'm just sharing with you some images to kind of give you that sense. The image on the bottom, in the middle on the bottom, is a retrospective that took place recently in UCCA of the artist Chao Fei. And you can kind of see like it's like the scenography has really transformed to adapt to the vast scale of, a kind of factory scale. And that factory scale is kind of also being convenient to tell the vast story of the immense kind of production of Chao Fei as well. Yeah, I mentioned a little bit about the idea of open and closed era. So, a bit more about my journey, I guess. I started working in Beijing well, originally as an artist between 2009 to 2011. But my first role, full-time role, was to work in what was then an artist-run project space, and I started working there in 2013. So around about the kind of years around that period of time, as I mentioned, like the Olympics was one big milestone to think, it's kind of drive to want to integrate with the world. But then you could also see certain tension. So I kind of another thing I think maybe it's just to just put out there. I was quite interested that at that time there was also a political drive to support football teams across China, and I think there's almost this parallel with the drive, the political drive to support institutions, and that kind of in a way fueled the museum boom. Maybe some people might dispute that, but it's always been something that I've kind of thought was quite interesting as a pattern. And now with football, I think this was once the greatest team in China and has become bankrupt recently. There's this kind of rise and fall as well of things, and I think that's in a way similar to institutions now as well. The bottom right was a moment just after the Arab Spring, where once upon a time you could use Facebook and Instagram, and then there was a kind of black wall where the two internets started to emerge, the internet that was outside and the internet that's inside. So that was also a moment where, when I first moved to Beijing, was kind of seeing this transition. Um, so I first started working as as a cultural worker, I would say, in a project space called Magician Space. I didn't go through a traditional route where, unfortunately, maybe I made the decision not to study curatorial practice a little bit because of just couldn't afford it, I think. And it's just maybe my personality is I just found it much better to learn as I work. It was similar also to language. I couldn't speak Mandarin fluently at the time, even now, probably I can say I'm proficient. But it was just through working where I learned everything on on the go, which sounds crazy, but maybe a slight influence was reading a book called Ignorant Schoolmaster by Jacques Rancière, which talks a lot about, that you kind of have to develop your own methodology. Like, that was my takeaway, at least, develop your own kind of unique methodology and the belief to have the capacity to learn and not be kind of yeah, feel nervous about kind of impracticalities maybe of trying to work in a space where you're not fluent with the language and kind of having maybe the arrogance of youth to try to push that through. But I would talk about magician space, and the idea that it was also self-organized, it was founded by artists, has been really formative for me as well. The name actually, so the name in Chinese, 魔镜时空间, and magician space, it's kind of a play, almost a phonetic translation of between languages. With English, it kind of has the idea of the play of appearances, or just a kind of sense of playfulness in general. In Chinese, it has more of an allusion to alchemy, and the idea of maybe finding value in something that is kind of considered, you know, um, something from something that's ordinary. It was coined by an artist called Zhuang Hui, who is from the 60s generation. So, a very kind of politically engaged generation who have experienced kind of social collectivism and the kind of transitions and the vast transformations that have happened. And I think that's also maybe a little bit of the logic of Magician Space for me as well, was it was a vehicle, a space to respond to all the vicissitudes of changes that were happening at the time. So to give you a sense of that, maybe in the idea of poetics and play and politics, Zhuang Hui's work I've just shared here as well in the middle. The first is a series of kind of gorges in in kind of holes bored into the land of places that were kind of earmarked to disappear because of the construction of the Three Gorges Dam. So in a way, it's a kind of futile attempt to kind of leave trace and acknowledgement of that. And he basically came from a background of photography, political photography, more and more into land interventions to then installation and sculpture. Another work of his in the middle is just pretending to paint the landscape. Um, it also reminds me a little bit of Chen Xiaosheng as well, of just these moments to capture change and to maybe position the individual in relation to this when the individual perhaps just feels like a small blip in the whole thing. And then there's these beautiful kind of portraits that he created where he would juxtapose and basically position himself close to various people that he playing with portraiture. So in this case, photographing selfies, side by side with different people that constitute society. And then there's these amazing photographs that he's created of these kind of mass portraits of like factories and schools and all these other collectives. And then he's kind of positioned himself almost like the Where's Wally person, or Waldo, I think that's in America that you call it. So like and there's this there's this kind of beautiful work of his. So, like I think that kind of sets the tone, did set the tone for a lot of interventions that we also kind of used exhibitions as kind of as a vehicle and medium to express. Without going into too much detail, I think maybe just to summarize, like one of the greatest kind of things about this job for me was the sense of trust and openness from the artists who were running this space. I think part of the reason why they decided to run the project space and how it eventually, as full disclaimer, became a commercial gallery was because also the absence of infrastructure and funding mechanisms in China at the time. Most of the experimental projects emerged through what eventually became kind of commercial entities. So, you can kind of see, like a constellation of spaces and initiatives from Vitamin Creative to Long March to Bowlesley, all doing important work that a museum or institution should be doing. But because we were able to kind of fund this ourselves, we were able to kind of circumnavigate certain restrictions, economic and political. So, for example, on the bottom left, it also was in a way solidarity building, and so not just restricted to Chinese artists per se or mainland Chinese artists. So the one bottom left is one of the major kind of first breakthrough, I would say, of installation work by Trevor Young, who eventually represented Hong Kong in the Hong Kong Pavilion in Venice Biennale. This is the first time he was a bit more overt with his sexuality. So he basically replicated the kind of scenography or the environment of a gay sauna and layered it into a space during the winter. On the bottom right is Ai Weiwei, just after I think he was out of house arrest, and originally wanted to do a retrospective in an institution. It wasn't possible, so he basically convinced a collective of various kind of spaces, most of them commercial, to kind of display his work almost as kind of defiance. Where else? Top right is the first solo show of Guan Xiao. The middle is a Dubai-born artist called Lantier Li Xie. This is an intervention. So it's a now defunct company that is one of the early kind of delivery kind of companies at the time. And it's kind of a moment of kind of stasis where, if you go to a major city in China, one of the first things you kind of experience is kind of this constant stream of delivery motorcyclists. And yeah, and so forth. So we can move to chapter 2 now. Experiments in Shanghai. So I think in contrast to Beijing, the rise of private museums, that's something that also emerged during this period of time, within this kind of 15-year period. And I kind of have like brackets and other bubbles. So what do I mean by that? When I think so. Here's another map of Shanghai and how things relate to one another. So it's very different from Beijing in terms of a very strict kind of axis from the center and so forth. And another big difference that has subsequently emerged is kind of an art zoning that is not just one singular; it's multiple and dispersed. Another kind of conjecture maybe for me is the composition of the city, how it's kind of managed. Maybe it's some of the effects and flow from the kind of partitions they experienced during kind of colonial pressure, as it was kind of partitioned by the various kind of colonial forces. And I think, but it's, the kind of byproduct of this has also been interesting in terms of the cosmopolitanism that has emerged in Shanghai, where you do kind of see, I wouldn't say fusion per se, but a flow between kind of various kind of influences, and that also kind of lend into what's unique. For example, the kind of middle image is the Shanghai Exhibition Center. It's kind of the Sino-Peak, Sino-Russell kind of alliance period. It's kind of very palatial. It's pretty Baroque at the same time. All sorts of things going on. And that was one of the kind of early exhibition centers. It kind of focuses a lot on heavy industry and progress for the rise of communism, and it also had agriculture exhibitions. That's It was also a place, maybe in contrast to Beijing, was a quite vibrant underground-ish kind of club scene. Beijing was more known for rock music, and in Shanghai, it was more kind of techno. And well, it does just give you an image as well of things, how things unfold in the city and the influence. Um, So when I talk about bubbles as well, I mean, there's a really well-written essay recently in Art Review about the Himalayas Museum and that being a kind of symptom of the rise and fall of museums in Shanghai. I won't go too much into that. But there's multiple centers that have emerged in different places, and the infrastructure that has kind of been immense, that's kind of been constructed behind that. That it's kind of an unprecedented kind of scale and pace has emerged to the point where you have now, as well as readaptations or like kind of repurposing of industrial kind of infrastructure, as you saw in 798, for example. You have also bespoke, brand new museums and auction houses, art fairs, storage, also kind of through political support and being part of maybe the economic growth of the city and that plan has really kind of been on a big drive. Although, and then, as indicated by the idea of the bubble, is there a certainty of how long they can last? We're already seeing some of these things teetering, not just museums, private museums, but also, for example, that zone on the bottom, on the right-hand side is Westbund, which is also going through quite inconsistent kind of and a lot of kind of disruptions that have happened as well. The place that I worked in for 4 years as senior curator was Rockbund Art Museum, uniquely against this backdrop and related to, the history of the city. This is one of the oldest and in an unprecedented way, like preserved. Originally was designed and built as a museum 96 years ago and continues to operate as a museum today. On the far right, you can see the kind of how things have kind of transformed. This is the middle is kind of post David Chipperfield renovation. So from the facade, he kind of built the volume on the back to increase capacity. It was formerly the Royal Asia Society, so very close to the kind of to the British kind of concession area, area of Shanghai as well. Um, just maybe show some glimpses as well of the work we did with the museum. You can kind of see here, the Cabinet of Curiosities kind of style of exhibitions. And here I think I've kind of it's quite moving image heavy that I shared, but giving you a sense of from the volume and the original ratio. I mean, one of the greatest things actually was the verticality of the structure. So you could kind of curate chapter by chapter. So very good for solo exhibitions. You could show kind of different sides of an artist and kind of progress. You could also do group shows as well. And I think moving image for me was also quite special to activate in this building. A little bit also because it shows maybe it's an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about what's permissible, what's not permissible, how these things appear and not, like with beyond the kind of logistics of objects coming into through customs. In the I think it's kind of can be quite liberating to kind of work in a virtual space and not be limited to the physicality of objects. But even that can also experience constraints. Like in terms of, for example, censorship, I guess, everything in the private museum has to go through kind of checks and kind of a procedure to get consent. But I think it's something where maybe just to talk very briefly about this, as a cultural worker, I think it's important to be aware of the idea of openness and closeness. It's not always like it's not a fixed kind of book or rule book. It's not as simple as that. and the need to, and everything is kind of dynamic and fluid and related to kind of thresholds that are, affected by the temperature of a given time. So, for example, I think it was pretty radical, very special for the current team that are custodians of this museum. They recently had a collaboration with Sissy Wu, who harked back to the Cultural Revolution period in China, where at one point in time, during the different lives of this museum building, it was reoccupied and repurposed to house forbidden books that were confiscated from the Cultural Revolution, and to then, in recent years, I think it was last year, in fact, was shown. So I want to kind of show that because often outside of the context in the West, particularly, there's this kind of reductive idea of, okay, like there's this lack of agency, of the impossibility of many things, and censorship is kind of often understood in a very like problematic and simple and reductive way. It's the idea of movement and fluidity, I think, is very important, and persistence can be often psychological. Other sonography, I guess, to share. Um, it's one of the joys of working as a cultural worker in China is, I guess, the pragmatism, the innovation of various teams and collaborators. It is a place where you can really make things, and where you could really be creative with the scenography. So, for example, the top right is actually the top left and top right are things that I was kind of very happy and proud of. This is Jez Fan's work, who you might know a lot of their work based in New York. So this is a kind of two-way mirror effect. So it was just it came with this kind of idea that we had was what happens if you could maybe encourage a viewership to first see and engage with the work retinally, to sort of see the patterns and the form, and then it kind of there's a path that leads you into the space, so you can experience it spatially and sculpturally, and there's just a way to layer and kind of add something, and I think I enjoy a lot of these kind of devices to add kind of certain theatricality. On the left, there was so this is a collaboration between Rockbund and Parasite. In fact, it was a kind of call and response kind of way of collaborating. So one institution would set the idea or proposal for an exhibition, and then in response, the second one would create a new idea, and so that you would have basically a partnership of two exhibitions that are a result of this. So this was Opera for Animals, kind of curated by Cosmin Costanas and Claire Shea, Ramen, Xie, and myself. And that was kind of nice to see, a lot of kind of cross exchange. And I think I was quite moved recently, last year, going to a retrospective in Museo Tameo in Mexico City, which is a huge retrospective of David Mandela's work. And in the kind of footnote, I'm not on the footnote, the kind of preface, he mentioned that he was inspired, or that they were inspired, the curators were inspired to curate that show through seeing this body of work. So it was near the end, kind of last years of David Mandela's life, was in collaboration with his partner Adam, a series of kind of performance masks to, I think he had at that time suffered a stroke, so was kind of bedridden for a while and still creating. And I think the curator saw this work and it inspired them to pursue this idea of a retrospective. And in return, actually, for me, I thought it was an impossible show to do because of the complexity of his practice, because of the difficulty maybe of accessing works. And then just seeing, that kind of completely blown out of the water with this beautiful exhibition was really something very special to see. So yeah, so now I'm gonna move on. I think timing. I've got 10 more minutes, so I'll try to squash this. But experiments in Hong Kong, and directing Parasite. So this is kind of post-COVID years. Thinking a lot of Parasite as, I mean, I somehow had this image of a multi-headed monster. So through many, it was founded in '96, pre-handover. experienced all these changes and has had so many lives. I think one source of encouragement for me, because it was very overwhelming, my first kind of director job, to take over such an important institution as one of the oldest in Asia, was this kind of comfort that he's survived and weathered so many storms. And as the name suggests, kind of including here actually the role of the design in this. So even the logo and the play with parasite, being a locus in orbit, or the idea of literally being a parasite as a kind of creature, I think is something that has powered it through, kind of help give direction and shape, and inspiration to be able to shapeshift. This is kind of archival images of earlier shows, initiatives, and again to highlight, artist initiated, right? So came from the grassroots. Um, this is a sense of its journey across the city as through its kind of different spaces is inhabited. So it started from the west and then moved into the east to its current location in Quarry Bay, which is an area that was kind of traditionally kind of industrial area. Kennedy Town was quite distant and remote in a way, before the MTR. Um, I guess I was just to show some images related to even the idea of Hong Kong. It's kind of considered a kind of future city, a mega city. It's also in contradiction to that, kind of feels like a village. But also in Hong Kong, what we understand is that it's an archipelago of like lots of islands. In fact, it has the peninsula. It has it's something that I was thinking a lot about as well. Is what do we mean when we think about our role in the city as well, and how that's understood, and to what depth and degree and engagement, and thinking of it more, as kind of a kind of constellation of relationships was very useful. The idea of shape shifting with real estate, so when places become expensive, when places go on decline, how to repurpose, quite interesting, like that, Parasite has this kind of mythological kind of idea, like from the outside, and then when you go inside the space, it's really, very restrictive. It's like only 3 meters tall. Um, and but it's been limitless in terms of different languages, and I think what powers that is something that's very interesting for me to think about. um so during the time I was the director, I was also kind of interested in all these kind of histories, thinking about our possibilities, and that in a way that we were in a crossroads of, how institutional shall we become. There was a sense of increased responsibility in many ways, because of the resources that we had, and we were able to kind of grow, to contribute to infrastructure. So, I was thinking about this vaguely in terms of also the idea of a decentralized concept of an institution, perhaps. So unconventional through how it occupies space, how it's able to give space, and that being also, it was a little bit off of the beaten path at this point. Before there were no spaces in the way that, I mean, not no spaces, sorry, that was um, a lot of people would be upset by that. There was, in a way, an absence of a kind of institutional international bridge at a certain point. This is before we have M plus and Tycoon appearing particularly into this. Um, so Parasite's always been kind of on the vanguard with this role in mind. And so once that kind of has changed dramatically, it was, what else can we do to support? And in a way, in a nutshell, was to summarize, to see how we could balance local interests with international. And it kind of, for me, meant maybe the addition of a space that could be more spontaneous and more agile, kind of harking back to the early days where we could have a more fixed formal space, for exhibitions, and kind of seeing that as a kind of decentralized but holistic approach to institution making, maybe, or kind of moving towards that direction. Maybe very quickly again, one of the interesting things about, one of the shows quite proud of was, a show that was created by a guest curator Zairong Shang, and inspired by Happy Together, which was also coincidentally kind of released during the handover period on Hong Kong. So how to think of Hong Kong's always been on reduced to being a kind of almost this descriptor of East and West kind of meets together, or inside China or outside China, like binary thinking, and in a way it was part of the beauty of the film was thinking about fluidity, thinking in non-binary terms, and we were thinking of a lot about that as well for the show, in the current kind of climate as well. So this was a way to think outside of the dilemmas of inside or outside China or between East or West. It was the third path, which was all about a conversation with Latin America and then to understand Hong Kong and thinking in a multi-directional way. I wish I could talk more about this, but maybe we can share later on. Um, so I think I've just shared a lot about unique models of cultural space making through these case studies, kind of encouragement of a pragmatic look of how art interrogates the urban flux. And for me, it's also led through that connection to unexpected territories and methodologies that might be considered impractical or impossible in from maybe more Western centric models. I think that there's a need to do that, particularly in Asia, so that we can sustain culture under complex changing conditions that happen very quickly. Cannot share. I mean, maybe this is. Maybe just quickly leave this so you can kind of quickly see this for 2 seconds. But this is a summary of research strands. Um, from the influence of the name of being power and adjacent to many things, thinking about how to channel and encompass migratory movements and histories, both contemporary and historical, working on different scales, to kind of think in a more holistic way about the alignment of what does being a curator mean related to what does it mean to be led and guided by artists, for example? Can these things be interchangeable? Thinking about the spaces and ecology that connects building, team, and community together. And more, that's something that I think a lot about was cross-border solidarities. So related to certain thresholds of things that can be possible in one given place, maybe through facilitating mobility and migration, and the third path out or within or inside, and to be intersected by other things. Was I think this movement and cross-border kind of conversation increasingly becoming important, and well, so yeah, I think there's some tactics maybe just to throw in the air, um, kind of idea of parasiting, that's the word. The idea of what did I mean by encircling the museum from the countryside, encircling the city center from the margin? Maybe that's a kind of Maoist kind of like framing, but the idea of maybe a guerrilla practice, and that's more specific to Parasite, for example, versus the contrast with Rockbund, which was basically has been there for 96 years and has been another kind of locus in another way where orbits emerged through international collaborations, ghosting through things. I think this is an influence from Ghost Bangkok, a very innovative kind of biennial format of as a way to kind of maybe temporarily possess or be possessed by certain things and having a more fluid sense of space and lack of finality perhaps, or lack of always having to territorialize something, thinking within the ideas of like infiltration. I think that's also maybe also an interesting language and tactic also, to navigate. Probably we got 4 more minutes, I think. Um, quickly, and then there was a collaboration between Parasite and Art Labor, which I think for me also broke the traditional divides between solo, group, artist, curator within this kind of idea of infrastructure that is absent or precarious. So Art Labor is it's basically free artists based in Saigon, but with origins from different areas of Vietnam. There's parallels to the situation in Hong Kong and also mainland China. And I think that solidarity was really incredible because they were unique in the sense of sustaining a collective that was a decade long between artists and being agile to make art visible in spaces that were not conventional for art to emerge from within. For example, in hospitals or on the bottom left image, a botanical garden. And I think we learned a lot of lessons from their kind of ideas. The collaboration that we did do ended up kind of repositioning the idea of here and elsewhere and the idea of rather than an extractive way of bringing something from somewhere and bringing it to somewhere to where we were to think more generatively about that. So before we in this case we worked a lot with indigenous groups in the Central Highlands. It was very important to actually think of rather than zero sum, the idea of like things happening simultaneously together. So there was an open sculpture show that happened before we shipped the works. It's a continuous kind of initiative that's happened by our labor that which we part of our budget supported. Works could exist in both places, had things that were kind of hopefully will have impact beyond the duration of an exhibition. This is another kind of collaboration with another collective, an artist duo, Enzo Camacho, Amy Lian. This was also a partnership, so some of you in New York may have seen this in PS1. Four institutions joining together to co-commission a film. I just talked a little bit about film being quite convenient as a medium, this kind of plasticity to kind of tell stories that are difficult. In this case, related to political violence, a massacre, a historic massacre that happened in Negros Island, and the work of connecting that to the work of activists that are building alliances between cultural workers and agrarian reform work and the role of institutions, how they kind of mix with that. This is a retrospective of Habit Chun, thinking about different histories. It was kind of also coming from an ecological sense of it's no longer sustainable to ship a lot of things here. And there was a discovery an artist who had a treasure trove of work. He passed away, I think, more than a decade ago, but had this kind of body of work that no one knew had existed. And part of the exhibition helped to fast track the research and the discovery of his work and connecting different people together to kind of build that legacy, to kind of shed light to this artist in a way. My last show in Parasite with the artist Pratchaya Pinform, which was basically, I'll just as general summary, he kind of he said something to me that really stayed with me for a long time and something I still think about, which was in the context of Parasite, but it could be applied to other art spaces. Was like, could the space still think alongside artists and not just be involved with constant production? So in this situation, one of the gestures, dramatic gestures, was to remove the windows, let everything else come in, and to resist this idea of again a kind of unsustainable way of dealing with things. And in this situation, a way to also ask questions about climate crisis and how we live with this. And now with YDP, what I'm working on right now is a performance program, which is kind of trying to embrace the empty building just before we go into full gear into the momentum of a program. And we're working with a lot of performance or artists across the spectrum of live art and different activations that happen every intervals of 3 weeks. We're kind of seeing participating artists as ensembles to push and question and think alongside us in terms of how to hold space, how to share space, and have a discussion about performance art as well, and the idea of the possibilities of our space. So I think that is the end of my presentation.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. So there are a few questions. We're running a little bit over, but the first one is from Song Lu, who's saying, I was really inspired by how many different regional contexts you're working with. After you've introduced so many different regional contexts in your practice, I'm curious, when you're working across cultures, how do you decide as a curator what needs to be translated for an audience and what can remain partially opaque?
Wow, really great question. I think I think the idea of being strategically opaque about things, maybe a quick response would be, I mean, through a lot of exchanges with colleagues and collaborators. Yeah, there's ideas of you can't. I mean, even with this talk, actually, it's like how much should I reveal? And some of these are like almost I wouldn't say trade secrets, but have been tools to allow things to progress and in a way to a space to kind of buffer to kind of have a safe space to work within, especially if you're dealing with sensitive topics. It's always a kind of constant dilemma. Um, and I guess it's irresolvable. But I think a lot about this in terms of rather than being paralyzed by the irresolvability of this. I do think courage is very important in this day and age. And
Hmm.
there's a difference between like irresponsible risk and I think noble risk, and the courage is the kind of barometer for that. Um,
Hmm.
and a commitment to want to help to and there may be a lot of things and dilemmas of okay, for example, for art labor we're working with indigenous groups in the central highland, which I don't have an immediate connection to in terms of sense of biography, and there is a kind of question, a rather valid question of to what degree and right do you have to showcase that. And I think it came from a sense of trust with art labor that they're not, you know, they, I think, are good people. They are honest people. I think there are concerns I have with their practice, and that is part of and to trust the conversations that we have with that in
Hmm.
relation to groups that we're working with. And rather than to not do it at all, is to have that courage to want and to feel that there is this need and value to do that. So maybe that's a kind of way to answer that question with some examples and to share with you.
Okay. Next, there's been a global appetite for new Chinese contemporary artists, and certainly a few who have succeeded in New York City. But in your experience, what is a sustainable career path for a Chinese artist working in China when self-expression might be limited?
I mean, in a nutshell, I think um, one way to see this as well is to see that to understand that there's multiple worlds, that people can traverse and work within. Um, when I was first working, I think in terms of from the perspective of an artist and the commercial viability and so forth, most of the collectors or people supporting Chinese art were maybe foreign or international in that bracket. And then in the last 15 years that I've kind of been here, kind of working there, has been, a kind of, the kind of rise of a kind of Chinese art world that's almost like can be independent in some ways, and in many ways also like supporting like with YDP, for example, we're very transcultural, and all of us in some ways have kind of connection to China, but we also have our roots elsewhere as well, and so it becomes like less binary in that way.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it really depends on what makes sense for the artist, in terms of what is kind of where the. I mean, I think a lot about art world in and the art world as a place where what kind of nutrients can they provide to you? It gives you the sense that you can thrive, and that can also apply. It be easily applied to a curator. Um, and so that's a very personal and individual situation, but there are options maybe to say.
Hmm. Okay. Last, how has this research and experience influenced your return to the urban space of London?
Yeah, interesting because I think London is kind of like a village. When we look at like Beijing or Shanghai, it's like a population of 24 million upwards, and but coming back to London, I think it's a strategic move in terms of it um to I think there was a possibility to work with a new organization, which is, as a curator, I think very precious from the beginning of its vision, and the impact that that can have. A little bit of this as well is that I think hopefully I've been able to convey this. Well, I haven't overtly conveyed this, sorry, in the in the free cities, but it's been very difficult to work in those cities as well through a lot of the fluctuations of change, particularly kind of ideological change, also gentrification and so forth. It's I mean, a part of me feels a little sense of regret that the promise of 10 or 15 years ago, and you compare it to now, what's left behind or what is there. The a little bit of me feels this sort of kind of there was a lost opportunity, window of opportunity.
Mm.
So needing to kind of reset a little bit and, regroup somewhere else. There's a little bit of that thinking. This is a very personal answer, actually. Maybe we should put it to the next conversation. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's it for questions. So thanks so much, Billy. Thanks to the audience for attending. And we'll see you next week, I hope. And Billy, so I'll see you in a minute on the student link.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.